Hey guys, Kenna here. So today we're going to kind of build on what we did last class. And I know last time we were talking about sustainability and natural capital. We looked at natural capital in the form of both ecosystem services and the natural resources you're probably more familiar with. So today we're going to start looking at how we use those resources and the amount of waste that we produce by taking a look at your ecological footprint. This is really the relationship between humans and their environment. Okay. If you measure how many resources you use and then start comparing that to the amount of waste you produce, you can start seeing just what kind of impact you're having on the planet. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at our essential questions and jump right in. So, number one, what is the relationship between humans and the environment? Let's go ahead and explore some of these ideas related to resource use and waste production. And then we'll go ahead and kind of take a look at, is that sustainable or is that not sustainable? Number two, what is natural capital degradation and what causes it? We talked about natural capital last class. Again, natural resources and ecosystem services. How do the actions of humans degrade those? How does it make it lower quality and less available? Number three, what are the two types of pollution and how do they differ? This is something that's going to go ahead and continue on throughout the rest of the year. Okay. So as we go ahead and take a look at this topic, these are two terms that you should make sure you're familiar with. And number four, how do we measure our impact on the environment and what its limitations are? Okay. All right. Now, before we go ahead and jump in and start going in on the regular notes, your first assignment for today is actually here. If you were stranded on an island, I want you to answer these four questions. Write it down on any sheet of paper that's around you, and then I want you to go ahead and type it up and email it to me. This does two things. One, gives me a chance to better understand you. Two, it makes me know that you're doing the notes. And three, I know that you can email me if you have any questions or concerns. Okay? So again, answer these four questions, type it up in an email and send it to me. That way I know you're doing the notes and I know that you're actually going ahead and able to email me. All right, so number one, choose one food to eat. So if you were stranded on a desert island and only could bring one type of food with you, what would it be and why? Number two, if you could only listen to one band for all of your music, what would it be and why? If you could bring one other person, who would that person be and why? And then if you could bring one item, I know Survivor used to do, you could have your one special item that you brought for yourself. What would yours be and why would you bring it? Let's take a minute, go ahead and write those things down. Go ahead and pause the video, send it to me, give me the email, let me know. All right. Okay, so hopefully you've gone ahead and sent that email to me. Appreciate that. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the role of humans in the environment. Now, throughout human history, we have both affected and been affected by the natural world. While we have had many good deal of losses in terms of environmental ecosystems, animals, species in general, much of what is valued by us about the environment has actually been preserved and protected through human action. So while we do, yes, do a lot of things that are dangerous or bad for the environment, we also do some things that are good. And while many uncertainties remain, there is the realization that environmental problems are becoming increasingly complex over time, especially as the issues become more and more global and less localized. Historically, we could start looking at, particular factories that were polluting. We could start looking at city level problems. But we're getting to the point now where most of the major environmental problems are actually global. Things like atmospheric pollution or global climate change that affect people that aren't directly involved in causing the problem in the first place. And so, as these become increasingly the focus of a lot of the environmental issues moving forward, we have to keep in mind of the role that we as humans play in causing them. And a lot of these concepts are in the Environmental Literacy Council's documents about what you should know about the environment. Okay? As we start exploring these, we have to realize that the human interactions between us and the environment are not static. Okay? These are things that are changing and changing in some cases pretty rapidly. Our understanding of the ecosystem and the way it functions, our understanding of the impact we're having on the environment, all of these things are constantly changing. And so we have to make sure that we're understanding that this is something that we're learning more about, that even when we go ahead and start thinking about the decisions that we made, what we think is the right thing at one point may no longer be the right thing down the road. Okay. One of the things that comes to mind when I start thinking about this is the spotted owl that we had in Oregon. For all intensive purposes, when they went ahead and did their environmental impact, they saw human clear cutting and logging in old growth forests as the largest cause for the decline in population numbers for the spotted owl. And while that definitely played a role, many years later, after basically banning a whole bunch of logging in these areas and taking it away as a resource for humans, they discovered that the largest the largest factor in terms of the spotted owl's decline was not human logging, but was actually due to climate change. And as temperatures were getting warmer, you were seeing other owls come north from California and taking over nesting sites. And so, even though the decision was made with the best of intentions, turns out that we didn't know as much as we thought we did about the environment and the impact that we were having on the environment, and lost a resource without actually having a whole bunch of benefit to the organism we were trying to protect. Okay. So, we also want you to keep a very open mind. Okay. Don't rush to this is the only way to do it as we go ahead and go through this term. The environment, while highly valued by most people, is used by a ton of people with a lot of different interests and values, and we have to take them all into account. Okay. We can't just say this is the only way because it impacts more than just the people that think that way. Okay. And because of this, there are going to be difficulties about how to ensure the protection of our environment and natural resources while still allowing for the economic growth and health and well being of the human society that relies on it as a resource. I know at the beginning of the term we already talked about this idea of a win win scenario, and I know that your textbook is really big on win win scenarios. But I think in most situations, there will always be trade offs. And oftentimes, okay, there are going to be unanticipated or unintended consequences that we didn't foresee because the environment is a complicated thing and we don't know how all of it works. And so we make our best guess and try and make some change, try and have some positive outcome. But it doesn't always work out the way we think it does. But a well managed environment can provide goods and services that are both essential for our well being as well as for continued economic prosperity. For you guys, the environment has become one of the most important issues, and it will continue to be in the future. I wish I could say that my generation, the generation before me, did more to go ahead and make this a problem that's not going to be very difficult. But unfortunately, we didn't. And so this is a challenge of our time, and it's going to continue to be for many years until we find a way to help balance the needs of the population here and we start looking at the planet's needs in terms of its survival. Because ultimately, if the planet doesn't survive, neither do we. And the challenge is to find approaches to environmental management that give people the quality of life they seek while protecting the environmental systems that are the foundations of our well being. So, in order to face these challenges, students today, you guys, will need more than just a superficial knowledge or awareness of how disconnected we are to environmental issues. The basic understanding of how these ecosystem services and natural resources work are going to help you to make more informed decisions about how we manage those resources moving forward for the benefit of the planet and ultimately for the benefit of us. And so we're going to have to rely on a multidisciplinary approach to learning that can build on the strengths of a wide range of fields of study: biology, botany, geology, so on and so forth, to provide a deeper understanding of the technological, political, and social options and strategies for both the studying and management between our society and the environment. And before you start thinking this is all doom and gloom and oh, everything's horrible and the world is going to hell in a handbasket, remember that many people have a much better quality of life than would have been possible if you go back to when we were hunter gatherers. Okay? Humans have learned to transform the raw materials of our planet into useful goods and services. And because of this, because of the tools we've been able to develop, because of the way we've been able to use our minds to capitalize on those resources, globally lifespans are increasing. Infant mortality is decreasing because of improved food supply, better air and water quality, access to education, which I think is a huge one, and disease prevention. People are living a lot longer. And in most places, those lives are better than they were many, many years ago. We have been able to protect and even recover some species and ecosystems. I think about the California condor, right? It was on the brink of extinction. I think there were only like 2 mating pairs left in the entire world. And we were able to bring them back from the brink of extinction. Still not in perfect shape, but this is a great success story in terms of human intervention preventing the extinction of a species. And our development of technologies has really helped with communication um, with other people working in the field, with the general public. We can get more information out to people more quickly than we ever could have historically. We can use the technology to monitor ecosystems, both from satellites in space, as well as by using monitoring stations that are connected using our digital world here on the planet's surface. And what this is telling us is that while we have all these tools and all this potential to change our interaction with the planet that we live on, humans are living unsustainably. And as such, we are seeing an increase in environmental degradation. Waste is building up. We're seeing a depletion of the available resources. And what is left tends to be degraded. It's in poorer quality. This is the tragedy of the commons, because there is no greater commons than the planet itself. And if you think of the planet as one giant natural resource that we're all depending upon, everybody's using it. But unfortunately, large numbers of people are exploiting it. And this ties back to our concept of the bees invoice that we watched on Friday. Human activities have overused about 60% of the Earth's ecosystem services. And most of that has been done since 1950. And so we need to think about what is the role of humans to protect and to use wisely. And we could take a page from our indigenous peoples we talked about last class and start thinking about the way they interact and see themselves as stewards or protectors of the environment. This concept of dominion, which has been in place in much of the Western world, where it's ours to use as we see fit, may not be a sustainable mindset that's going to allow our planet to continue and still provide the resources we need to survive as humans. So what are some examples of natural capital degradation? Remember, this is both ecosystem services and natural resources. If we start on the right, you can see water pollution. Pretty obvious one, I think. Declining oceans and fisheries, once thought to be one of the greatest common pool resources. It was abundant, never ending. but it turns out that it's not maybe as abundant or never ending as we thought it was as we move further and further out, harvesting more and more fish. And the technology that we have now allows us to do much greater damage much more quickly to those stocks of fish in the oceans. Aquifer depletion. We'll talk more about this when we go ahead and get into our water unit. Okay. You see in the center there shrinking forests, mostly due to human deforestation. As we shrink those forests, we see a degraded wildlife habitat. So it's not as good for those animals that are still left, those plants that are still left. And in some cases, to the point where we're seeing species extinction. With less forests, less plants on land to protect it, we're seeing an increase in soil erosion. This causes problems. It's polluting our lakes, rivers, and streams with increased amounts of sediment, which is changing the pH of the water, the clarity of the water, which is bad for our fish and aquatic populations. And then on the far left there, we see climate change and air pollution, which we'll focus more on next term. All right. So I want to give you an example as we go ahead and take a look at some of this stuff. And this is Los Roques Archipelago. This is in the Lesser Antilles. My wife and I actually lived in the island of St. Kitts, which you can kind of see here towards the center. It says St. Kitts and Nevis, twin sister islands as an individual country. And so we were in the Antilles as well. It's just below, just kind of southeast of San Juan. You can see the arrow pointing to it. But located in the Caribbean Sea, Los Roques Archipelago is a large chain of islands about 120 kilometers or 80 miles north of the Venezuelan mainland. The area was declared a national park in 1972 to protect its coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds, as well as the many species of seabirds and aquatic life that inhabit the islands. The park contains about 61 species of corals, 200 species of crustaceans, 140 species of mollusks, 45 species of fish, and 92 species of birds. Now, that picture on the right shows you the shore of Los Roques. Now, remember, this is already designated as a national park. So where is all this trash coming from? Okay. They don't have a lot of human traffic on the island, except for with some of the tours and the people that are native to the island. So if you look at the other islands around it, you've got St. Vincent, the Grenadines, you've got Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago. So when we have tourism, sometimes you get stuff that's just dumped into the oceans. If there's a Caribbean cruise, you just throw it off the boat. Well, that one person throwing that one cup may not seem like a big deal, but if a lot of people are doing that, it ends up washing up on the shore like you see here. That can have a pretty big impact on places like this. So we've got to really kind of keep in mind the impact of the decisions that we make. Because ultimately, when we start thinking about the environment, it's going to be decisions made by individuals like you that change the course of what's going to happen with respect to our planet. And this ties back to how our ecological footprints are affecting Earth. We have the power to degrade or to sustain Earth's life support system. And you have to make that decision. Okay? Over time, growth of ecological footprints, them getting bigger and bigger, depletes and degrades the Earth's natural capital. So the less we can use, the more we can reuse in terms of limiting the amount of waste is going to determine the outcomes. And so, is there good news? I think so. I think what we're realizing is that you have the power to make a difference. Okay. You make those decisions to do something better for the planet. And then other people see you making those decisions and they're more likely to make those decisions. And it ends up being this kind of grassroots campaign where we can make a difference in terms of how our planet works. Now, there are some disparities in terms of how resource use occurs on the planet. Okay. The more developed countries definitely use far more of the resources and produce far more waste And this only accounts for about 17% of the world's population. This is US, Canada, Japan, Australia, Western Europe. The less developed countries, which make up about 83% of the world's population, have less income. And so there typically is less consumption, less consumerism. This includes your middle income places like China, Brazil, Thailand, and Mexico, as well as your low income areas like Congo and Haiti. The other piece of this, when we start looking at your resource use and your imprint in terms of your footprint, is the amount of pollution that we produce. Now, we should probably start by going ahead and defining pollution. So pollution is a contamination of the environment by any polluting substance, what we would call a pollutant. This could be chemical, noise, heat, so on and so forth, at levels that are considered harmful to the health, survival, and activities of organisms. And this includes the health, survival, and activities of us as humans. Now, there are some naturally occurring forms of pollution. We think about volcanoes and the carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide they exhume. Okay. But there's also a lot by humans, including burning things like fossil fuels. So when we start looking at human produced pollution, we look at contribution in two forms. We have what's known as a point source pollution, and this comes from a single identified point, like a smokestack. Okay. When we start looking at motor vehicles, we can figure out exactly where that pollution is coming from, and we could potentially do something to limit the amount of pollution produced by that particular source. The harder one to do is what's called a non-point source pollution. Because it's dispersed from a bunch of different places, it's difficult to pinpoint just exactly, oh, that's where it came from. And hopefully you'll keep in mind that example of the Los Roques Islands. Okay, we can't necessarily say this all came from this one place that's easy to clean up. It's a bunch of different people doing different things in different places, and it just adds up. And we have lots of examples of these. We have trash in streams, but we also have like runoff from farm fields. Okay, definitely something we deal with here in Oregon is when people put on fertilizer, and sometimes they put on too much and it runs off because rain comes. We get rain a lot here in the Willamette Valley, and then it runs down into our rivers, and our rivers are now contaminated with this runoff. Changes the pH, the chemical load, which is not good for the wildlife in the rivers. We can start looking at the deposition of air pollutants. This is what Rachel Carson was talking about when she was going over the examples in a Silent Spring, okay, with DDT. So there's a lot of things to kind of keep in mind here. It's not just easy to go ahead and point the finger saying this is where it came from. And so how do we deal with this pollution? What do we go ahead and do moving forward? Well, there really are just two things that we can do right now. One, either clean up the pollution that's there, okay, try to dilute it or reduce the amount of pollutants in the environment to help protect the planet. Or two, probably the better one in the long term, prevent it from ever happening. This reduces or eliminates the production of pollutants to begin with. And so then you don't have the pollution. So historically, this is where I go ahead and give you the big push that we have the Solve Alliance, and they go ahead and have thousands of volunteers that go ahead and clean the beaches. And last year and this year, it's being canceled because of COVID. There are still some small local things where they are still getting together, but you have to make reservations because they can only have so many people, and it's put on primarily at the town level. But you can still go online, search for these, and sign up, and some of them may still be available. So there isn't one for 2021, but this has been going on since 1986 and is a homegrown tradition. Twice a year, the beach cleanups have benefited people and wildlife alike, supporting clean seas and healthy communities around them. So great thing to look at. In the bottom right there, you see nurdles and fish eggs. Nurdles are essentially little pebble-sized pieces of plastic that have been washed over and worn down by the ocean. And if you look at them, they look surprisingly similar to fish eggs. And so fish and birds will actually go down trying to eat them, and then they end up with a belly full of plastic. So if we can clean up the beach, take away those plastics that then won't get worn down into these nurdles that get consumed or eaten, you are taking action to try and help prevent, future contamination, as well as to keep our planet healthy and clean. All right. So there are things you can do. There's always places that you can look to make a difference. So today we want you to go ahead and really kind of evaluate what is your personal impact on the environment. And we do that using what's known as an ecological footprint. So a definition here we'll start with: an ecological footprint is the amount of land and water needed to supply an individual or a population with renewable resources and to absorb, recycle wastes and pollution of such resource use. Okay. The one that we typically are going to go ahead and use is the one called footprintcalculator.org. And so you'll get to do that in your assignment today. And what is it going to go ahead and look at? Well, it's going to go ahead and look at your energy use, settlement, where you live, how much paper you use, what kind of food do you eat, where does that food come from, what's your seafood impact, to ultimately kind of get an estimation of your impact on the planet. But as good as this is to kind of get you a starting point, I think it's obviously got a point where it's trying to get you to realize how bad things are. So there are some limitations when we start looking at these ecological footprints. One, they're not always very transparent about how they do their calculations. You'll see an estimate of how many Earths you would need to support if everybody lived like you. How do they do that calculation? To make them accessible to a wide audience, they often oversimplify the results and fail to disclose some of the methods of how they calculate. Okay. It's definitely valuable as a starting point to get you talking and thinking about the impact that you have, but I don't know that I would take it as the end all be all. The next thing is that it's got limited inputs because nobody's going to want to sit there and spend hours taking this footprint calculator quiz or whatever. The calculations can be pretty useful, but it is important to realize that they only are taking in so much data, and so it's only going to be so reliable. The more data you give it, the more reliable the result's going to be. And so I want you to go ahead and keep that in mind as you go ahead and approach this calculator. Use it as a starting point. Maybe instead of thinking, oh, this is it, talk to your peers, talk to your friends. Are you higher or are you lower? If you're higher, what can you do to lower yours compared to your peers? If you're lower, can you help your peers to lower theirs? What are the decisions that you're making that made yours different from theirs? Thinking about what impact that has on the planet. So approach this with kind of a skeptical mindset. Okay, be critical, try and be as comprehensive as possible, but realize that this has its limits and is just a starting point for us to start talking. When you're finished with your footprint, I want you to think about what surprised you the most. Okay, what do you think are the two most unsustainable components of your life, and what are two really sustainable components that you have? What are some ways that you could reduce your footprint, and how easy or difficult would that be for you to make those changes? Now, before we jump out and let you get started, I want you to think about this statistic. Okay? The current population of the United States of America is 328,976 328,976,922 people as of Friday, June 14th, 2019, based on the last UN estimates. As such, the US population is equivalent to about 4.27% of the total world population. However, the United States makes up about 15% of the world's ecological footprint. So we use 3 times more resources, produce that much more waste than our population should be. How do you think you and others could go ahead and fix this problem? Our ecological footprints ultimately are growing at this point in time. And that growth of ecological footprints leads to degradation of natural capital. Remember, ecosystem services and natural resources, and results in the creation of pollution and waste. And we identified two types: point source solution, pollution and non point source pollution. And so, unfortunately, we have what's identified as an ecological deficit. And this occurs when the ecological footprint is larger than the biological capacity to replenish the resources and absorb the waste and pollution. We are using more than our planet can provide and sustain, excuse me, and sustain in the long run. And so, this deficit that we're identifying here suggests that humans are living unsustainably. And as a planet, the humans on our planet are running up a pretty large ecological deficit that is expected to keep growing. So, what steps can you take? What steps can we take to try and make that less the case and try and protect our planet for future generations that are going to need it? Whether that's your children or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren, leaving the planet in a better position than it is today. All right, guys, stay safe, stay healthy. I'll talk to you soon. So long.